Good morning, everyone. Great full house, delighted to see that. We're going to start now, now that everybody's assembled and has found one of those rare parking spaces out the front. Good for you. My name is Maggie Taggart. Today, the Commission is delighted to reveal the findings of updated research into the impact and the recommendation and making recommendations on how the UK Government could offer a better deal with the Shared Prosperity Fund, or whatever funding mechanism should take its place. So first of all, I'm going to kick off the events to introduce to you Neil Anderson, who's the Deputy Chief Commissioner of the Equality Commission, and he was formerly head of NSPCC. Would you like to come and say a few words?
Thank you for that, Maggie, and thanks for being with us here today. It's an important role you have, keeping us all moving along. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at this wonderful venue. It's great to see so many of you here from across the community and voluntary sector, government and public bodies, all committed to advancing equality in Northern Ireland. We're here to explore the Commission's latest research on what has happened since the end of EU funding and what this means for Section 75 equality groups and organisations that support them. The European Social Fund played a vital role for decades in supporting communities and addressing disadvantage. The key question we wanted to explore was, has the UK Shared Prosperity Fund delivered what was needed? To help answer that, we commissioned new research, and I'd like to thank Dr. Eve Hepburn and the Horizons team for carrying out this important research, and Dr. Hepburn will be taking us through the key findings in just a moment. It's been 3 years since the Commission first published its research into the impact of Brexit on EU funding for Section 75 equality groups in Northern Ireland. Now, in 2025, with new funding streams in place through the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, this research provides a timely update and revisits the impact of changes to funding in Northern Ireland. So how has the transition from EU funding impacted equality groups here? What we know so far is this: the end of EU structural funding and the introduction of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund has marked a period of significant change for equality groups and the organisations that support them. We've heard concerns about reduced funding, shorter timeframes and greater uncertainty for those providing essential services. And a particular concern here in Northern Ireland is that the Shared Prosperity Fund is managed centrally by a UK government department not designated under Section 75, meaning the equality protections that we expect do not apply in the same way. Northern Ireland also remains the only part of the UK without direct local control over implementation of the fund, and this is something many have told us raises concerns around accountability and responsiveness. We've heard about a shift in focus from social inclusion to economic inactivity and the risks that this brings for people and communities who may no longer fit neatly into funding priorities. On a more positive note, some recipients of shared prosperity funding have spoken about there being reduced bureaucracy, which is good, and more flexibility than with previous EU funding streams. And there have been positive experiences reported about collaborative working in the move towards consortia projects. The researchers have benefited from speaking to a range of people within different sectors, and these experiences and views have been captured within the report we're launching at this event, and it's great to see so many of you here today. The report captures the views of organisations supporting Section 75 groups and people who've been directly impacted by the change from EU to UK funding. We're pleased to have the NICFA Chief Executive, Celine McStravick, with us this morning, and Celine's here to give us her views on what this funding shift has meant for the community and voluntary sector and the people it serves. And then after that, we're delighted to host a panel discussion with frontline leaders who'll tell us more about how these changes are playing out in practice. So welcome and thank you to Edith Dunlop from the Northern Ireland Union for Supported Employment, Lynn Carville from Women's Tech, Susan Russum from JMZNI, and Claire Meanahan from Include Youth. Thank you for being here. Your insights will be invaluable. We want this to be a conversation, and there'll be an opportunity to share experiences and ask questions, raise issues and offer your ideas. Whether your experiences have been negative or positive, we want to hear about any opportunities as well as challenges. The experiences you all share today will help show how the changes have impacted the real lives of people in Northern Ireland. At the Equality Commission, we are clear the UK Government Department managing the Shared Prosperity Fund must be designated under Section 75, because without that, we risk eroding the equality protections that underpin our society. We've made this case to the Secretary of State and will continue to do so. So, look, thank you again for being here this morning, for everything you do to uphold equality in Northern Ireland. Let's have a morning of discussion and shared learning and hopefully renewed purpose. And please do stay for lunch and continue in the conversation. There are plenty of staff from the Commission here today and we'll be happy to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil. Well, as Neil specified, the aim today is to give you the information and then to spark off a discussion, and that will all feed into what the Equality Commission wants to put forward. The main body of today's work, I suppose, is to hear what the research is, and I'm going to introduce now Dr. Eve Hepburn. She will give the... You've got the document on your table, but I don't expect you to scan through that just yet. You probably, like me, go to the recommendations at the end. Eve is Director of Research and Development at Horizons Research. She's an Honorary Fellow at the University of Edinburgh and Managing Director of Policy Scribe. So prior to embarking on a career in policy consultancy in 2017, Eve was Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Edinburgh, and she's also held academic positions at universities across Europe and North America for the past 20 years. So she will describe the background to the current, naturally, unsatisfactory situation and end with recommendations, but the Equality Commission wants your views and suggestions, and you will have an ample chance later on to give us those views and to ask questions with a roving microphone, which I'm sure people will be delegated to run around with. So if we could introduce Dr. Eve. Come on in.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Commission for inviting me to be here to present our research findings. It is so lovely to see so many of you again here today. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Eve. I'm the lead researcher for this project, along with Lewis and Hannah from Horizons Research. So the UK's decision to leave the European Union has had multiple effects on the economies, societies and labour markets of this country. And today we're going to be unravelling one of those important threads, how the loss of EU funding and the transition to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund has affected equality groups in Northern Ireland. And this is very much a live issue. While the report focused on the initial funding period, which ended in March, we're now in a further transition period. The UK government has extended the funding till March 2026 in advance of wider reforms. This means there's a short amount of time to review the funding model to best meet the needs of Northern Ireland's communities, and we hope this report is useful in those discussions. So what will I be covering in this presentation? I'll begin by telling you a bit about our research approach. I'll be giving you an overview of the UK SPF and its development in Northern Ireland. I'll then present some case studies of how the transition impacted equality groups in Northern Ireland before finishing up with a comparative analysis and our policy recommendations. So last year we were commissioned by the ECNI to conduct a research project for which the main research question was what have been the impacts of the post-Brexit transition from EU funding to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund on Section 75 equality groups in Northern Ireland. And we adopted a mixed methods and comparative approach to this question, analysing the impacts on different equality groups across Northern Ireland, looking for similarities and differences. And we employed a range of methods for the project. So this included a review of the literature and quantitative analysis of the EU and the UK SPF funding streams, research interviews with policymakers, a survey of voluntary and community sector groups and interviews with their representatives, case studies on Section 75 groups, a comparative analysis of impacts, and an engagement event with stakeholders. So we collected a lot of data, hence the length of this report. Now, a lot has happened over the last few years, so I thought it might be helpful to offer a timeline of how we got to this point. So in January 2020, the UK left the European Union. This came after a referendum in which the UK population voted to leave by 52%, though Northern Ireland voted to remain by 56%. At the time, the UK government said it would fully replace the EU structural funds. And in May 21, the Community Renewal Fund was launched, which was a one-year bridge funding between the EU funding and the UK SPF. In February 22, the Northern Ireland Executive collapsed, which meant that Northern Ireland didn't have a functioning executive or assembly when the new funding was being developed and rolled out. In April 22, the UK SPF was launched and a competition held with deadlines later that year. But funding allocations weren't announced in Northern Ireland until the 31st of March 2023, the very same day the EU funding in Northern Ireland ended. And this cliff edge left many organisations facing staff losses, which I'll come to later. Meanwhile, the Windsor Framework was adopted in March 23, and in February 24, the Power Sharing Executive was restored. In July 24, Labour came to power following a general election, and in October, the Chancellor committed to extending the UK SPF for 1 year, albeit for existing projects only and at a reduced funding level. Finally, in March of this year, the initial UK SPF funding period ended and the 1 year extension began, which means that we still have to see what will happen after March 2026. Okay, everyone still with me? Okay, good. Right, let's dive in. So the UK Shared Prosperity Fund was a 2.6 billion fund to level up economies, local economies across the UK. It was first mentioned in the Conservative Party manifesto of 2017 as a replacement for the structural funds, by which I'm talking primarily about the European Social Fund and the European Regional and Development Fund. But when the UK SPF was launched in April 22, this commitment changed. It would now only be a successor to those EU funds, and this meant that the funding amounts and priorities were not like for like. Unlike the EU funds, which were managed by devolved governments, the UK SPF was centrally managed by the UK government, as we heard from Neil. It was a core part of the levelling up agenda of that time, and there were 3 priority areas: communities and place, support for local business, and people and skills, which focused on tackling economic inactivity. The funding period was from April 22 to March 25, though due to delays in funding, it didn't actually commence in Great Britain until December 22, and it wasn't until April 23 that it commenced in Northern Ireland. Importantly, while the funding was allocated to local authorities in Great Britain, in Northern Ireland, the UK Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, or DLUC for short, centrally allocated the money across Northern Ireland as a whole. And I just want to mention here that while Labour changed the name of the government department last year, removing Levelling Up from the title, we still refer to DLUC throughout this report for consistency. So that's what I'll refer to today. So when the new funding model was being developed, the UK government said that it would match EU funding levels. So was this the case? Here we have two tables on this slide. So the top one showing the ERDF and ESF funding allocations per year on average between 2014 and 2020, and the bottom one showing the UK SPF funding allocations. So in the top table, you'll see that the UK received 1.3 billion on average per year from the ESF and ERDF. So that's highlighted in pink there. In the bottom table, you'll see that the UK SPF fund ramped up between 2022 and 2025, with funding for the UK reaching 1.5 billion by 2025. However, on average, this works out at about 880 million per year over the 3-year period, which was quite a bit less than the EU funding. So how was the UK SPF delivered in Northern Ireland? Well, the prospectus stated that its aims can be best achieved by delivery close to local people and businesses by authorities that understand each place's unique local context and identity. And for that reason, local authorities were the main delivery agents of the funding in Great Britain. But in Northern Ireland, the UK SPF was delivered by DLUC, for Northern Ireland as a whole. And so to bring in local expertise, DLUC set up a partnership group in July 2022 to advise on the investment plan for Northern Ireland. And the group was comprised of UK government officials, local authorities, and key groups in civil society. But there was no devolved Northern Ireland representation on the group. And we were informed that the Northern Ireland Executive had been invited to join, but felt unable to do so because of the lack of Section 75 designation for the funding. Furthermore, while the UK government said it would take devolved policies into account with the funding, Northern Ireland officials couldn't actually access the data being collected by DLUC. So this resulted in what some people called a bit of a policy gap. So what were the equalities provisions with the funding? So the UK SPF stated that local authorities needed to meet their obligations under the Equality Act in carrying out their duties in relation to the fund. However, the Equality Act doesn't apply in Northern Ireland. Instead, the Northern Ireland Act makes equality provisions for Section 75 groups. And Section 75 requires public authorities to conduct an equality impact assessment if a policy has major implications for equality, which the UK SPF arguably did. However, DLUC is not a designated body under Section 75, and it wasn't required to conduct this assessment of the new funding, which led to the Northern Ireland Executive decision not to sit on the partnership group. So what was the outcome of the UK SPF funding allocations? In Northern Ireland, 18 successful economic inactivity projects were funded, and these were largely based on consortia of organisations. So you can see the whole list here on this slide. As you'll see at the bottom of the table, the total amount invested in Northern Ireland over the 2-year period was 57.6 million, amounting to 28.8 million per year. And to put this into context, it might be helpful to compare this to previous EU funding levels. And we have two tables here. So the top one compares the ERDF and ESF funding for Northern Ireland in column A with the UK SPF funding in column B. We'll see that Northern Ireland received about 62.7 million on average from the previous EU funds per year, and it received about 42.3 million per year under the UK SPF. UK SPF includes the Multiply Numeracy Programme, manufacturing and innovation funding, and core funding. So this suggests that there is about a 20 million shortfall in funds to Northern Ireland. Meanwhile, if we turn to the bottom table, we've zoned in specifically on the European Social Fund and the economic inactivity stream of the UK SPF, which are the most comparable for our purposes here. And we compared ESF Call 2 and Call 3 with the UK SPF funding for economic inactivity. And we see that the total for the UK SPF of 28.8 million was a bit less than the previous EU rounds, which were closer to 40 million. But there's a caveat. If you look at the top row, you'll see that the core UK contribution is actually slightly higher per year than the EU contribution, so 28.8 million rather than about 26 million. Now, this suggests that the big shortfall experienced by organisations was actually due to the lack of match funding for the UK SPF. So while the UK SPF represents a significant shortfall in comparison to the EU funding, the absence of match funding, often by the Northern Ireland Executive, also had a big impact. So how did the funding transition impact groups in Northern Ireland? Well, firstly, the late announcement of funding on the same day that EU projects ended created a lot of stress for organisations as well as staff losses due to redundancies and job uncertainty. Second, the new consortia model to deliver the UK SPF projects was seen to benefit collaboration by organisations who were successful in receiving funding, although some other organisations felt it created unnecessary competition. Third, there was general relief that funding was available, but it represented a large reduction of up to 50% for some groups compared to the previous EU funding, resulted in job losses and cuts to services, and for those who were unsuccessful, many had to close services. Fourth, there was a sense of frustration around the move away from social inclusion to focus specifically on economic inactivity, which meant that projects couldn't help people who were unemployed, in part-time or insecure work, or in education and training, to name a few. And finally, recipients noted fewer reporting requirements, which was seen as a plus. So how did the UK SPF support equality groups? Well, several of the economic inactivity projects had a focus on Section 75. So 2 projects focused on people with disabilities, and a third had a very strong emphasis on disabled people. And disability was the largest equalities-related focus under the UK SPF in Northern Ireland, accounting for about 37% of the funding. 3 projects aimed at young people, which was the second largest equalities focus, with 14% of the funding. 2 projects aimed specifically at women, accounting for 3.7% of the funding, and 1 project focused on migrant and ethnic minority people, with just under 1% of the funding. And in addition to this, the UK SPF funded a range of general economic inactivity projects, as well as projects supporting other groups such as ex-offenders. And I'm now going to dive into our case studies just to give you a more granular sense of how the transition impacted Section 75 groups. And our first case study is on disabled people. In the left box, you'll see that projects supporting disabled people received 15.6 million in the final year of ESF funding, Call 3, compared to 8.4 million per year under the UK SPF, which is a 46% reduction in funding. By way of background, over 24% of the Northern Ireland population has a long-term health condition or a disability that affects their day-to-day lives, and the employment rate of disabled people in Northern Ireland is the lowest in the UK. As a result, support for disabled people had been a key target under the ESF funding, especially the social inclusion strand. The impacts of the transition were felt largely negatively by disabled people. Prior to the cliff edge, groups reported staff losses, and those who won funding had reduced capacity to deliver services to disabled people due to budget cuts. In addition, the stricter eligibility criteria led to the exclusion of those who were unemployed or in supported employment. The shorter time frame and focus on employment outcomes led to the exclusion of those furthest from the labour market. And unsuccessful applicants had to close programmes affecting people with disabilities and their families. Our next case study is on children and young people. And again, in the left blue box, you'll see that projects supporting young people in Northern Ireland received 9.9 million under the ESF Call 3, compared to 3.99 million per year under the UK SPF. So this is about a 57% reduction in funding. Young people in Northern Ireland aged 16 to 24 have the highest unemployment rate of any equality group in Northern Ireland. And support for young people not in employment, education and training, or NEET as it's called, have been a key target under the ESF strands on accessing employment and social inclusion. The funding transition was very challenging for youth work organisations due to job losses associated with the cliff edge and reduced services due to funding cuts. So overall, this was seen to negatively impact on young people. In addition, the focus on economic inactivity led to the exclusion of many young people not in employment, education or training who'd been eligible under the ESF. The focus on employment outcomes and the short timeframes of the funding made it difficult to provide more holistic support to people most in need. And the eligibility criteria meant that organisations couldn't include certain vulnerable groups in their projects, like unaccompanied minors. Our third case study is on women. And again, in the left blue box, you'll see that projects supporting women receive 1.58 million per year under the ESF Call 3, compared to 1.07 million per year under the UK SPF, so a 32% reduction in funding. Women have significantly higher rates of unemployment and economic inactivity in Northern Ireland compared to men, which are also higher than across the UK as a whole. And while women were less of a focus under ESF compared to disabled people and young people, as we just saw, there were high levels of women's participation in the ESF community family support projects. The transition to the UK SPF had a significant impact on women's organisations, with many experiencing job losses and closing services. And at the same time, some organisations who hadn't received ESF funding were now successful under the UK SPF. The transition to the UK SPF was seen to have unequal geographical impacts, with some women's groups outside Belfast and in rural areas that had previously won EU funding. They'd been unsuccessful under the UK SPF and had to shut services, so that led to a reduction in support for women in those areas. The focus on economic inactivity also meant that groups couldn't support certain categories of women, so older women not of working age, women in part-time jobs, on job seekers allowance and training, and women with families who'd previously received EU support. Our fourth case study is on ethnic minority communities, and in the left box you'll see that projects supporting this group received 240,000 per year under the UK SPF. And while they were a partial focus under the previous ESF funding, there were actually no ESF projects targeting them specifically. By way of background, people from ethnic minorities represent 3.4% of the population in Northern Ireland, and research suggests that many ethnic minority people have experienced racism, as we saw in Ballymena recently, which has created challenges in accessing work. So the unemployment rate amongst ethnic minorities in Northern Ireland is more than double the overall rate, especially amongst women. The transition to the UK SPF, though, was felt quite differently for this group, as there'd been no project specifically focused on them under ESF Call 3. With the UK funding, one project was funded, the Migrant Access Programme. But in the course of this research, we found that several minority ethnic organisations told us they didn't know about the UK SPF funding and they hadn't felt consulted about it. There was also a broad sense across all of the voluntary community sector organisations we spoke to that the needs of ethnic minorities were not fully being taken into account. And finally, that stricter focus on economic inactivity meant that people who were unemployed, in insecure employment or asylum seekers couldn't benefit from the UK SPF funding. Our final case study is on LGBT plus communities, and this is another relatively small population. The 2021 census found that 2.1% of the population identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual or other. Now, researchers have described the LGBT community in Northern Ireland as a hidden population due to the lack of public policy focus, services and data monitoring. LGBT people in Northern Ireland face discrimination both inside and out of the workplace, creating barriers for employment. LGBT people have a lower economic activity rate than average in Northern Ireland. Despite this, there were no projects specifically targeting LGBT people in Northern Ireland, either through the UK SPF or through ESF Call 3. However, this group felt the indirect effects of the funding transition. There was a sense that the community was not seen as important enough by funders. LGBT organisations found it difficult to apply for larger amounts of funding, which is usually expected to benefit large numbers of people, due to the small number of service users that they had, especially in rural areas. And finally, LGBT groups told us that the smaller UK SPF pot had led other organisations to apply for funding elsewhere, from trusts and the lottery, which LGBT organisations had relied on, but now they were failing to get that funding due to greater competition. So how do the impacts of the transition compare across equality groups? Well, we've found that there's a number of common impacts. So all the community and voluntary sector organisations we spoke to had been affected by reductions in funding of up to 50% compared to the ESF. There were significant staff losses across the sector resulting from the cliff edge announcement, and there have been cuts in services, especially for people who do not fall into the economic inactivity criteria. There was also a strong sense that the post-conflict legacy of Northern Ireland had not been taken into account. But there are also differences. As we have seen, some equality issues received more funding than others. Some organisations were more badly affected by others, especially for smaller and rural organisations. And some equality issues didn't receive funding from either the ESF or the UK SPF. We've tried to identify some variables to explain the difference in impacts on equality groups. So the first is organisational resources. So some larger organisations have more diversified income streams to help them navigate times of uncertainty, and they're maybe better placed to pivot to different funding requirements. In contrast, some smaller organisations may have less capacity to maintain staff, write funding applications, and pivot to different funders' needs. Another variable is networks. Some organisations have more capacity to build partnerships across Northern Ireland and develop direct links with policymakers, while others maybe are more locally oriented with less capacity for networking. Some organisations are more aligned with the UK SPF, more focused on economically inactive people, so this was less of a pivot for them, while others had been supporting a wide range of people across society and had to cut services. With consortia, some organisations found it easier if they had complementary skills around a topic. It was harder to establish these partnerships when one or more partners had overlapping services, which created competition. Next, some Section 75 equality groups received more public attention and more donations and support than others, helping give them a stronger voice. And finally, there was a sense that the UK SPF process favoured larger and Belfast-based organisations who could provide Northern Ireland-wide provision. This was felt to come at the expense of smaller, locally oriented and rural organisations. I'm going to switch lenses for a moment just to consider the impacts of the transition across the UK, because we found that there were some similarities with Scotland, Wales and England. So these included funding shortfalls, a lack of consultation on the UK SPF, limited devolved input into the UK SPF, and challenges in delivering services due to shorter time periods. At the same time, our interviewees felt that there were factors specific to Northern Ireland that made the impacts feel differently here. These included the late notification of funding in Northern Ireland, the central management of the funds, the absence of devolved government at a crucial period, the lack of match funding, unlike other parts of the UK, stricter economic inactivity criteria, and the post-conflict legacy and needs of society in Northern Ireland. Looking at the bigger picture, the project found that there are a wide range of benefits and challenges with the funding transition. So on the plus side, research participants spoke positively about the availability of funding, the benefits from collaboration, less bureaucracy, as Neil mentioned earlier, cost models that included things like staff sickness and maternity leave, and good relations with DLUC staff. On the other hand, we were told that there were a number of concerns around the funding shortfalls, shorter timescales, minimal consultation, ongoing staff retention issues in the sector, the absence of a social inclusion focus, a lack of focus on geographical inequalities, and the lack of designation of DLUC in respect to Section 75. So we've identified a number of recommendations for future funding models to help inform decision-making around what will happen after March 2026. And we've separated them into 4 categories. So the first has to do with funding amounts and duration. They are to increase UK SPF funding from 2026 onwards to align with the amounts received from the EU, to explore optional match funding from Northern Ireland departments, to fill in the funding gaps for organisations that can't apply to the UK SPF this year, to give more autonomy over funding allocations to local partners, as we've seen in the rest of the UK, to create longer multi-year funding periods for the UK SPF of 3 to 5 years, and to maintain flexibility to allow organisations to repurpose funds. The second set of recommendations has to do with funding management and delivery. To ensure that monitoring and reporting requirements for the funding are appropriate, to clearly communicate in a timely way the application process for funding, to support organisations that need a bit of extra help with their applications, and to create specific funding streams to address disadvantage amongst groups. Our third set of recommendations has to do with policy alignment and equalities. To reintroduce a social inclusion focus, to ensure the funding is joined up with devolved policies through Northern Ireland executive involvement, to designate the managing authority for funding under Section 75, to build the promotion of equality into the funding criteria and to align funding equality criteria with Northern Ireland's social inclusion strategies, and to ensure that funding bodies and panels have experience of equality issues. Finally, our last set of recommendations address future decision-making and consultation. To ensure that future funding is based on robust evidence and equality data, to develop a substantive consultation process for future funding models, and to avoid another cliff edge by providing clarity on the post-March 26 funding to allow for consultation and planning. So that's a whistle-stop tour of our very large report. Thank you for your attention, and thank you especially to all of the people who participated in this project. We're very grateful. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
So the questions and answers time now. We have people with microphones who will deliver it to your table if you have something for Dr. Hepburn to answer. There will be a chance later on also for you to express opinions, but specifically for any questions. To Eve, anybody have anything they want spelt out a bit more clearly? Yes. Okay, you take this.
Thanks. Thank you so much for that. Sorry, my name is Shruti, and I'm from Diversity Mark. Thank you so much for giving a rundown on that, all the issues and the recommendations. So just going to your recommendation, I had a quick question. Wanted to understand, you said to look at alternate funding for the match funding. Where do you think that can come from, if not the NI executive?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So this was an interesting point in the comparison with the rest of the UK, because projects in England, Wales and Scotland had been encouraged to find match funding from other organisations, including trusts and National Lottery and other funders. The match funding for the ESF previously in Northern Ireland was largely through the Northern Ireland Executive, as far as I am aware. I think in order to advance that recommendation, we need more discussion around about what that match funding might look like and where it might come from. Some of the groups that we spoke to were actually relieved that the UK SPF didn't have a match funding requirement, so they didn't have to go out and find that additional funding. Others said that the lack of the option to have match funding limited the amount of money that they could bring in for their projects. I think it's definitely an area that should be considered in more detail as the discussions continue around future funding models, to make sure that there's an awareness of where that match funding might come from and how that might be applied for in time for the deadlines.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else want a mic delivered? While you're thinking, let me ask one which is slightly political. What impact do you think the absence of an assembly at the time, at that relevant time, had on the way things turned out, and also the reluctance to take part because of the Section 75 absence?
So for our research participants and for ourselves as researchers as well, there was a sense that there was a lack of representation in the public, in the media, around the potential impacts of the funding transition on equality groups. And because there wasn't a functioning assembly or executive at the time, there wasn't that strong voice in Northern Ireland representing all of those different voices of the community to the UK government at the time. So that was felt to be a disadvantage compared to the rest of the UK. Having said that, though, colleagues in the assemblies and governments of Wales and Scotland would also equally say that although they were functioning at the time of the UK SPF rollout, they were unable to have a significant impact or input into the development of the funding itself. It seemed like it was very closed doors. However, they were able to voice their opinions on the UK funding process throughout, and that was something that perhaps was lacking a little bit in Northern Ireland and fell more to groups in the voluntary and community sector. What was the second question, Maggie?
I believe there's a reluctance to take part because of the absence of Section 75 mentioned.
Thank you. So that was quite interesting in the course of the research to get a strong understanding of how the UK SPF partnership group was formed. So when we spoke to officials from DLUC, they told us that they had invited the Northern Ireland Executive to come and sit on the partnership group for the UK SPF and even act as a secretariat for that group. And they were looking to have devolved input into the funding model. However, the Northern Ireland Executive felt that because DLUC, who was managing the fund, was not designated under Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act, it was unable to sit on that group because the equalities provisions were not fully being taken into account. So there was a difficulty there due to the legislation not being taken into account, of Section 75 legislation not being taken into account. Having said that, there was a willingness on both sides within the Northern Ireland executive and departments and DLUC to try and work together as much as they possibly could. So it's not that they were kind of stomping off in a hissy fit. There was a desire to work together. However, the arrangements of the UK SPF, whereby it was essentially managed by DLUC, whereby DLUC was not designated under Section 75, prohibited that from happening.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? There'll be time later, so don't worry about it. Thank you very much indeed for that report.
Thank you very much.
Now, if you're watching some of the slides, one organisation was specifically mentioned in the impact, and that was the Derry Women's Centre being adversely affected. So we're now going to hear a video account of what happened from Catherine Barr, the Chief Executive of the Derry Women's Centre.
Women's Centre Derry received funding for 10 years from ESF. It was to provide training for education and training to women within our community. We provided access to childcare and an on-site delivery, which was a good model. Unfortunately, we were shocked and devastated when we found out that we didn't receive ESF funding, and most importantly, we had to cut down and reduce the services that we provide in our community. We are now trying to build ourselves up and work with other collaborations and partnerships to be able to deliver these services.
So now we're going to hear from a person who's very important in giving views on this, and that is the NICFA Chief Executive, Celine McStravick. Celine, would you want to make your way to the microphone? Celine has been Chief Executive of NICFA since 2023, and her key responsibility, very relevant here, is to engage with government ministers and their departments on policy issues which interest voluntary and community organisation. The floor is yours, Celine.
Thank you so much. And lovely to see lots of friends and colleagues in the room. Pardon me as I get my summer cold, as it always happens. I'm kind of standing here thinking, how many more reports do we need to hear the results from? It's quite hard every time I come to these things and think, am I saying the same things over and over again? And are we actually making any difference? Because I suppose running NICFA, our role is to support the voluntary and community sector to thrive. We have over 1,500 members across Northern Ireland, so the move from ESF to UK Shared Prosperity really damaged not only some of our members, but actually the whole infrastructure of our sector. Because for me, I just kind of want to bring this away from the wonderful stats, and I really have to commend the Quality Commission for an incredible report that will be used many, many times over. But I want to move from the numbers and think about the people. So when I think of ESF, I think of the young person with a learning disability, or the older woman returning to work after years of caregiving, or someone recovering from trauma or addiction. Those people that need others to believe in them and to invest in them, and for them to not remain a statistic. And ESF provided that. It provided that source of income, that programme that gave people what we would call a second chance. And inevitably, that second chance is delivered by the voluntary and community sector in Northern Ireland. So I think that's what we talk about when we talk about the money. We're actually thinking about the people at the end of that funding application. And that's where the voluntary and community sector are often our own worst enemy, because it's really difficult for us to say to those people, the money's not there, therefore we have to stop. Because our sector always step in where the public services can't reach. We're the ones who sit down with all of these people and say, let us walk with you through your change and your journey. Let us offer you the skills, the encouragement, the childcare, that wraparound support that our public services can't help with. So when ESF left Northern Ireland, you've heard from our research, that was about £40 million a year, and that critical 35% match funding from NI government departments. It helped over 77,000 people during its time here. And in NICFA, we talk about that's not a stat, that's a movement, that's a process, that's a way of working, that's a set of principles that all came with ESF funding. We were driven by social inclusion, and we were driven by putting people first. So that's what happened when we lost ESF. More than money, I would say. It was about the wraparound support for people with complex needs, proven results for people with mental health issues. And you know something? When I look at our waiting lists for mental health support, our waiting lists for the NHS here, our inability to get GP appointments, etc., I think, goodness gracious me, how much more worse is it going to get now when we look into the future? I've referred to that match funding, and it's been referred to in the research, but actually, again, that was more than money. Our members would tell us that money was vitally important. They couldn't run their projects without it. But what it also gave was connectivity to policy making. It embedded the programmes and what our government departments were doing, and it didn't let government off the hook. There's a definite feeling that UK Shared Prosperity lets our government departments off the hook at the moment. So in 2023, UK Shared Prosperity entered the landscape. And I kind of want to call it what it is. I was at a workshop held by Department for Finance, Innovation and Consultancy Services on Tuesday. And again, I try not to get too cynical in this job, but lots of people around my table were saying, let's be honest, UK SPS was just a holding card. We're not sure what to do, but let's ring fence some money and see how this all goes. And I think our public sector might have been surprised. The voluntary community sector weren't surprised because we knew that no matter what, we weren't going to let the people down. We knew, even though it was lastminute.com and the guidance was all a bit woolly, that we were still going to rise to the challenge. And as usual, the voluntary and community sector stood up very quickly, even though there was a £20 million drop in funding, even though the services for ESF were constantly left in limbo, delayed, disrupted, even though many staff were made redundant, and even though some projects had to shut down overnight, we stood up. We formed consortiums. We put those people at the forefront of our plans. Those are the people with learning disability, the women, the ex-prisoners, the ethnic minority community. Because do you know what? I'm not sure anyone else would have. That's what really worries me. It worries me that it's always left to the voluntary and community sector. I often say to our politicians to close their eyes for a few minutes and imagine Northern Ireland without our sector. Shame on us for leaving it to a sector that is constantly trying to drive forward change with annual contracts, with piecemeal bits of money, when the most important issues facing our society today are about those needs of Section 75 groups. You know, the Women's Centre is a great example, where it had a 30% reduction in funding. And last night I had the absolute privilege of being at an event with George Mitchell, who referred to the role of women and peace. And how did we reward our women who got us into our peaceful times? We cut our funding, we cut their training, we cut their childcare, and we just said, you'll manage. And I suppose the other bigger picture is that stat that's often thrown at Northern Ireland. We have the highest economic inactivity rate in the UK, 26.7%. Not something that we want to be proud of. That's over 300,000 people of working age. We also have the highest poverty rates, etc., etc. We don't want to be in those league tables. We're not interested. We want to see change. And yet change will never come if we keep playing with people's lives with short-termism and lack of any strategic thinking regarding the people who need us the most. So I suppose I would ask people in this audience to say, can we afford to continue doing what we're doing? Genuinely. Are we going to sit here in another 5 years and go, oh, well, that was another funding programme, how did all that go? It does feel like Groundhog Day. At NICFA, we run the Economic and Activity Inclusion Network. Basically, we brought together all the groups who had got UK Shared Prosperity and the groups who were disappointed that they didn't. And we said to them, we need to be part of the conversation for driving forward policy in this area, not just about money. Because it's far too easy for government to say, we've given you money, stop calling us names, stop shouting at us. Well, I'm here to tell you we're not going to stop shouting because we can't bear this any longer. Our sector is completely on its knees. I speak to our members every single day at events like this. People are exhausted, they're tired, they're embarrassed that we're here again. How can we show our faces to the people that we're working with when we can't tell them what's going to happen after March 2026? It's a here we go again. Underneath all of that tiredness and cynicism, our sector are full of the most talented leaders, so agile, so able to turn issues and problems into innovative solutions. And yet, why do I feel like we aren't being heard? Our Economic and Activity Coalition have been working hard to kind of come up with some key asks, and over the next few months you're going to hear a lot of these. But what's frustrating for me is, surely this is common sense. It's hardly rocket science. That we need a successor fund, it's going to be called the Local Growth Fund. So we're going from ESF to UK Shared Prosperity to Local Growth Fund. That's how we play with people's lives in the UK. We need a successor fund that is more than just about money. We need one that's about multi-year investment so organisations can plan, retain staff and continue to innovate. Hardly rocket science. We need the voluntary and community sector to be at the very heart of that co-design and delivery. Not a nice to have, not a we'll invite you when we have got a draft, not a sitting at the sidelines, and not a you should be glad just to be asked. We should be at the heart of co-design because we know what's best. We've been doing it for decades. We want to see integrated strategies. We're looking at 1.9 million people in Northern Ireland. Think about that. And yet, we love a strategy. We want an economic one, we want a health one, we want a mental health one, we want a transport one, we want all of that. Here's a shock to your system, folks. We're talking about the same people. The same people who aren't doing well in school, most likely will have a mental health condition, may also have a disability, may end up with some of their family in prison. They are the same people. Why do our strategies insist on creating silos so we have no accountability for change? Enough's enough. We want simple and fair funding processes that are open to all, that do not exclude the smaller community organisations, that do not play to the people who have the time and capacity to fill out all of those forms, because often it's our smaller community-based organisations that can actually reach out to those people who need them the most. It's not about rocket science. I'll tell you what it is about. It's about human rights. And it's about us all in Northern Ireland, you wait for it, catching ourselves on. Can we just actually be strategic? Can we invest to save? Can we be serious about preventing crisis instead of saying we'll sort that out 20 years down the line? I'll leave you with a few points. Yes, we have a high rate of economic inactivity. We have some of the deepest inequalities across the UK. What happened in Ballymena should be a reminder to all of us that it's not just our sector that's on the cliff edge, but society is on the cliff edge. Those living in poverty, most disengaged from decision making in Northern Ireland, are trying to make their voice heard. We may not agree with what they're saying, but we have to listen. And I think we will regret the day if we ignore what's happening at community level. I would say we have one of the most resilient voluntary sectors across these islands. I work really closely with my colleagues in Scotland, England, Wales, and in Southern Ireland. And when they hear what we have to face day in, day out, they ask me, how are you still standing? How are your members still there? How are these people able to do all of this? I'm not sure they'll still be there in 5 years. I'm worried about succession planning. I'm worried about young people moving into our sector. Because as one person said to me recently, after I come off a radio interview, they said, you're talking about retention in your sector. Why would I want to work there? That sounds awful. And that's part of our problem. So I'm selling it as a wonderful place to work. I'm selling the voluntary community sector as a place that's full of amazing leaders who are incredibly resilient. And I'm selling it as a place where we are reaching those people who are most vulnerable. So all of those Section 75 groups, that's our sector. We're working with them day in, day out. So my final plea, please don't waste the critical 4 or 5 months when we're building the new answer to UK Share Prosperity. Please don't let our government departments off the hook and accept mediocrity. Please, let's build on what's working. We do not need novel ideas. We need sustainability, scaling up, long-termism and accountability, because we fund the second chances, and that's what's most important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an unusual blend of inspiring and disheartening. So very good. It was a wonderful speech. Before we move on, can I just say you've probably noticed a photographer who was around the area earlier on, and if any of you have an objection to the photograph being used in the Equality Commission paperwork, then let somebody know at the interval which this is. And this is a comfort break, no coffee, no tea, but a chance to catch your breath and use the facilities. Are you okay, Claire? Okay, welcome back, everyone. Well, almost everyone. So we'll see a few more people coming in. As you can see, our panel is ready and waiting here, but we're not just turning to them right this minute. We are first of all going to see another video, and that is from David Babington, the Chief Executive of Action Mental Health.
Action Mental Health really welcomes this very overdue research. It's very, very timely as we see that we're coming into the current programme of 2 years of UK Share Prosperity Fund funding. We all know that it's not adequate. It has not been enough since the end of European Social Fund funding in April 23. And we know that it's not providing the right support for those people who are the most vulnerable, the most marginalised. In Action Mental Health's example, we have half the number of clients who are being supported, and they're being supported for only a quarter of the time. Inevitably, those with the greatest needs have effectively been abandoned. We don't have enough time to work with them, to provide them with the proper social inclusion supports. So ladies and gentlemen, I would encourage all of you to take whatever time you can, whatever influence you have, to tell those people who can have some influence on the new programme, we need more support. In 2025, going into 2026, it is time to provide the right support for those who have been marginalised and abandoned up to now.
Give him a round of applause. Even though he can't hear us, but he'll get feedback. Right, we're going to hear from this wonderful panel here of people involved in the sector. So I'm going to ask them just to give a little bit of an intro. They will be Lynn Carville of Women's Tech, Susan Russum of GEMS NI, and I had to look this up, Gasworks Unemployment Managing Service, Claire Menahan from Include Youth, and Edith Dunlop from the Northern Ireland Union of Supported Employment. So Can we start at that end? Yeah.
Am I on, Alan? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. As you said, my name's Edith Dunlop from the Northern Ireland Union of Supported Employment. And, you know, I'm delighted to be here today. I'm delighted to see the recommendations from the report. It's long overdue and timely, as David has said. The sector that I represent now are people with disabilities, the organisations that support people with disabilities. And I think that we've already heard today the impact that the changes have made in moving from ESF funding to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. As David has said, people have been abandoned. Those who most need the support are not necessarily getting the support. We heard that 50%, organisations were cut by 50%. So they are delivering half of what they were able to deliver under ESF. And at a time when we need more funding and need more support to help people who are the furthest removed from the labour market. And people with disabilities are in that group. They're very much, the people with learning disabilities and people with mental health issues have been recognised through the Equality Commission as being that group of people who are the furthest removed. So really we need more support to help to get people in. But the funding has been cut. And as we know, once it's cut, it's hard to get it back again. As Celine had said, we have a lot of strategies out there, and there is a disability and employment strategy. We don't know where it is at the moment, but we do need to get it actioned to be able to ensure that we're doing the right area of work in relation to people with disabilities. But I just wanted to pick up on a few things as well, just to sort of say we very much do talk about statistics and we talk about the numbers of people that are there, but it is very much about the individual. And what we have found in this last round with regards to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, that those people who needed the most support are not in receipt of that. Those people who we would have been able to support through a longer time at getting them into work or getting them ready for work, organisations are not necessarily been able to provide that support. So I suppose for today, we say we need to take these recommendations from this report. We need to look to see and plan and co-design the next round for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And we do need to align it to local strategies as well. But we need to be careful in what we're looking for as well. But the key thing here for ourselves in relation to disability is that we do need more support to help more people with disabilities to get them in employment. We have the lowest rate of employment for people with disabilities in the UK. We're also included in the highest rate of economic inactivity. So if we're going to make this change, and we're not going to be sitting here in 5 years' time, there's a lot more action is needed to be taken. So thank you.
Okay, and Lynn?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lynn Carville, and I'm Chief Executive of Women's Tech. I really enjoyed Eve's summation this morning of the report. The statistics and the figures and the money is shocking, but actually I'm not shocked at all because Brexit was never going to have a beneficial impact on our service users or on our sector, and that's where this all started. The transition for us at Women's Tech has been very different than others. We were in the place where Catherine from Women's Centre Derry, when she was speaking this morning, we were in that place in 2018 when we weren't successful in our ESF bid to the ESF at that stage and lost 80% of our funding back then. It was absolutely horrendous, and because I know the people who lost the money at this stage, what it must feel like, but with hindsight, it was probably the best thing ever happened to us at Women's Tech because we were forced to diversify our funding and our income streams. So, Pyrrhic victory in many ways, but that was the case at the time. When I first was interviewed by Eve back, I think it was about a year ago, and I hadn't thought about the interview before we were on, but she said, what has your experience been of this? But ours has been relatively, forgetting about the money part of it, but has been a very positive one because some of our experiences under ESF were very not positive, let's say. When I think back, it's quite sore and quite hard to the programme that predated the one that we didn't actually receive. There has been more flexibility. There has been less bureaucracy, and it has enabled us to, run the services that we needed to run. However, addressing economic inactivity, which does suit Women's Tech, as an organisation, you have to realise that we are working with those who need the most help, which absolutely takes increased resources, and that's maybe what hasn't been available. It takes more effort, it takes more resource, it takes more time, and I don't think that government or government departments realise that. If you're serious about addressing something, you put the resource and the funding into it. Also realise I'm very shocked about the 3%, well, over just 3% funding to women. I mean, structural barriers are very, very much in place around infrastructure, around care, childcare, social care, elder care, and unfortunately at this point in time, it's the issues around domestic violence and the supports that we need around that. So none of those are recognised within the policies and the structures that that we're in at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Claire.
Yeah. Good morning, and thanks for inviting me to speak. My name is Claire Minahan, and I'm a Regional Director with Include Youth, an organisation that empowers children and young people to thrive. Include Youth, we're a regional rights-based organisation, 7 sites across Northern Ireland, and we work with 1,600 young people per year, very much specialising in employability programmes for care experience and disadvantaged young people. So a wee bit about the context. I'm here today to talk about the impact that the loss of ESF and EU structural funds had on Include Youth specifically, on our service delivery and for our young people, but also the wider impact it had on the voluntary community sector, specifically coming from the youth work context. Include Youth's been running employability programmes for care experienced young people since 1989 through its Give and Take programme. From 2008 to 2023, 15 years, Include Youth had been in receipt of ESF funding. Within the youth sector and for Include Youth, it had provided multi-year funding to support those young people who were furthest from the labour market, which for Include Youth was care experienced young people. The main priorities within ESF were to combat poverty and to promote social inclusion. And one of its priority areas was to support young people in need of education, employment and training. This context provided opportunities for organisations like Include Youth to tackle the barriers that young people with complex needs encountered and to provide opportunities for them to gain life skills, confidence, to get qualifications as well as work experience so that young people had positive pathways to employment. It promoted lifelong learning, recognising the progression for young people was also into education and training and not just into employment. For young people in care, it's important that we support them from care to career rather than just trying to push them into low-skilled and low-paid jobs. The value and impact of youth work in relation to youth employability was highly recognised. ETI inspections found that 97% of the youth work provision was good or very good. 45% were seen to be outstanding. The youth sector has developed an expertise in supporting those hard-to-reach young people and have been really successful in progressing them back into education, employment and training. The benefits for us of ESF was the multi-year funding. It allowed for the longer-term interventions and support. It had a higher unit cost and there was the opportunity to have match funding. The transition from ESF to UK Shared Prosperity Fund has been really difficult and happened within the context of COVID, which impacted significantly on our young people, increasing the cost of living and also with no Northern Ireland Assembly. It was a perfect storm, often referred to as a cliff edge. In the face of that time, we faced staff redundancies. We lost experienced and qualified staff. It was right to the wire. I remember talking to Eve this morning and saying on the 31st of March, we had staff meditating in our office, waiting to hear if they would have jobs the next day. In that, while we were lucky enough to gain shared prosperity funding, we lost a valuable service. We lost our transition service, which stayed with young people for up to a year once they moved on from us. With the end of the EU structural funds and the transition to shared prosperity fund, there were challenges, but there were also opportunities. Narrowing the criteria for eligibility, where the focus moved away from NEET to economic inactivity, meant that a lot of the young people who were at risk of social inclusion weren't able to be part of our programme. The cliff edge, as I mentioned earlier, was significant and I think still gives us all post-traumatic stress. The difference between ESF and UK Shared Prosperity Fund, we are now in a leading consortium of 7 organisations. We have changed from being a lead partner to being a partner. The short-term funding is worrying. The strong emphasis on local council areas as opposed to a regional approach has been difficult, and the eligibility criteria has been narrowed. Recommendations, we would ask and we would call to widen the eligibility so that there's more focus on social inclusion. We recognise the regional impact. We recognise the value and impact of youth work in the area of youth employability. We don't reinvent the wheel. We've done, it's tried and tested, we know what works, that there is appropriate administration, that we take the good from both and that we move forward with a commitment to improving the lives of people here in Northern Ireland, and that we align the programme going forward into Northern Ireland policy. We ask for match funding and that it is aligned with Section 75. And finally, can we just ask that we remove the cliff edge? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And finally, Edith. Sorry, Susan, sorry.
Hi everyone, thank you very much indeed. My name's Susan Russum, I work for GEMS NI, and I'll start by qualifying that I experience transient aphasia, which means sometimes I can't speak. So Edith and everybody else will speak for me if I can't do that. First of all, I've been doing this for 25 plus years, and I think that one of the things that you need to have when you're in this business is the ability to shapeshift, to actually crowbar yourself, your organisation and everything else into a funding stream without losing the value proposition that you actually try to make. I've spent probably 50% of my time over the last 2 years trying to move money about to actually ensure that we're still able to do what we do. And I've done that by looking at filler projects with small amounts of money to be able to cross-subsidise what we haven't got enough to do with. And it's been fairly traumatic. As my colleagues have said here, the cliff edge up to the 31st of March 2023 was extremely traumatic, not just for us and our organisations, but also those that we seek to serve, those who expect us to give them a voice, and we continue to try and do that in fairly straitened circumstances. And, you know, it was only when Eve spelled out the differences and the challenges that the ending of ESF and ERDF and other funds have actually brought, and the narrowing of the criteria in which you can actually help people. And that really struck me, that there was a huge amount of people, a huge gap, and that with UK Shared Prosperity funding that we couldn't actually work with. And we had to try, scheme and do lots and lots of things to be able to work with those people who were just as deserving and just as much in need of a sustainable job as others. And that has been very, very problematic. But I think also just to really say, you know, thanks to NICFA for continuing to really, champion the needs. Also, thank you so much to the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland, who really have kept the agenda on focus here through this and other things, including the rights of minority ethnic people, the rights of women, the rights of children in education and other things, but also just to pay a little bit of, say thanks to the Department for Finance, who might think, gosh, what are you saying that for, because you can't put thanks in your pocket, but actually just to say, you know, that you have tried to watch over and tried to make a difference to communities and lives in an environment where nothing is actually hard and fast. We had the spending review a couple of weeks ago, and we've heard that UK Shared Prosperity funding will remain in Northern Ireland not as a devolve, but to March of 2028. So the jury's out on what's actually going to happen there. I think one of the challenges for me is that I believe that working with other organisations, such as the people that are sitting on the panel with me and people in the audience, that complementary expertise and that value proposition and the willingness to make a difference is something that really sets our sector apart, that we may be called third sector, but we're not third rate. But I spend my time worrying about how I'm going to pay my staff salaries. Couple of months in a year, I get a bit of a grant or a bit of a relaxation for that. But most of the time, I'm worrying about just the on costs and other things. And my plea would be that we have this report now. We really do need to ensure that it gets to the right ears in our government departments, in organisations that can actually take it to where it needs to go, that we do have fit-for-purpose funding for the next 5 to 10 years, and that we can all continue to make a difference to communities and lives. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have microphones at the ready for anybody to ask any questions of our panel. And who's going to be first? Okay, I'll start you off and give you time to think. Okay, so the first one, well, I think Lynn, when you said something about losing your funding and then you worked hard and you diversified, I think a lot of people want to know, where did you diversify to and how did you get the money to make up the shortfall, if indeed it did fulfill that object?
Do you know what? I don't know, and I don't like thinking about it because it is completely traumatising. I mean, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my whole life. And you gird your loins and you go out and you talk to everybody who will listen to you. And it's not about the jobs and it's not about your organisation, but it's about your service users and, in our case, the women that we were working with. And you do find that there are people, you know, who are receptive to this. But it takes time. It takes time for money to come in. So I'm sure we did contract in some way, you know, like we got smaller to build up again, but it was necessary. And I went back, I talked to a lot of people at that time, you know, I'm thinking of Alwyn and Niacro and others like who'd been through maybe similar experiences. When you were in ESF, I don't know if it's the same with UK Share Prosperity, your head is down and you are delivering. That's what you're doing. 50% bureaucracy, and with all your audits and all the everything that you're doing, accounting for everything that you're doing, and you're with a 50% delivery, and you don't have a chance to actually look at your organisation and the sustainability of it. So, you know, it's just I learnt a lot. With hindsight, it was a useful thing, which made UK Shared Prosperity just be probably better for us than maybe what it was for others, because it was extra and allowed us to bring that employability focus back into our work.
Well, I'm sure that will chime with a lot of people who are as a constant battle looking for funding sources and constantly filling out forms and application forms. Anybody sparked off? No? Okay. Claire, I wanted to ask you about the funding and the NEETs, the impact on NEETs. Can you give us any, you know, personal?
Yeah, certainly. I'll give you an example. So with care experienced young people in Northern Ireland, a lot of the cohort of young people we work with are separated and unaccompanied young people arriving into Northern Ireland. Just by default, they weren't eligible for this programme. So while they were the young people referred to us through the trusts, only if they had the right to work were they eligible. They still had the same needs. They still were care experienced. They still needed the same supports. However, they weren't eligible under that programme.
Right, okay. Yes? Question down here.
Is it on? Yeah, it is. Can you hear me? Thank you. Norman Starrett from Triangle Progression to Employment Service. We would be the lead partner in the Prosper Consortium, a group of 5 voluntary sector organisations that came together to deliver that. Just sort of, I was interested in, and thanks to the Equality Commission, excellent piece of work, and even the team. It's nice and clear. It's sharp. It's a tool that we can take and make use of. One of the recommendations was in and around match funding, and I'm asking a question, but I don't necessarily think people are going to have the answer to this. But I suppose I have mixed feelings about the match funding aspect of it, in that how do we ensure that if match funding is a key component of what we're doing going forward, that the statutory sector that provides that match funding doesn't exert undue control or influence over projects that basically can subdue or take away the innovation that the projects are trying to do, and also how they don't use their influence to deliver their statutory duties, thereby not getting additionality as opposed to duplicating what they should be doing anyway.
Hi, Norman. Thank you for the question. I have to say that my experience in the past of match funding is one being where the contents of my stomach dropped to my toes. It's been extremely difficult. It hasn't been structured. It hasn't been, it's been a point of not what you know, it's been a point of almost who you know, and it's been incredibly difficult. Therefore, if there is to be a return to match funding, then there needs to be a clear and unequivocal process for how organisations that are seeking to apply for UK shared prosperity funds or whatever the legacy funding is for that, that there are clear ways in which we can meet potential match funders to hear what their criteria are linked to their policy, their strategy for their government departments, and indeed the amount of money that they're able to set aside to support that match funding differential, because that's where the biggest problem comes in. You can write the most beautiful funding application, you can promote the most exceptional way in which you can support the key policy priorities that are out there. But it doesn't matter a button if you can't actually switch that match funding agreement on. So we need to be a little bit more rounded and equal, and perhaps the Equality Commission could have a footprint in that to help and support those match funding decisions, which were not, in my view and my sort of experience, were very much clustered to what you know, as opposed to how best can we make these funds go.
Lynn, did you want to add
Yes,
to that?
I'm very sceptical about the match funding issue, and I only sort of understood it this morning when I heard Celine talking about it. I mean, it's coming to the end of June, which is like coming up to Christmas. Everybody in this room is going to know what I'm saying, right? Feet haven't touched the ground in 2 weeks. Everybody's knackered, and I start ranting and raving at this stage just before a wee break happens. But I think what would happen is if match funding became an issue, your fund will be cut by 1/3 and you'll have to find 1/3 elsewhere. That's the reality of it. The money isn't there unless something happens and there's something really good happens and I get a break and I become less cynical. Your money will be cut, your project will be cut, and you'll have to find the money. So, for example, from our perspective, like in working with women, there is no women's department. There is no department that has responsibility for women. There is no gender equality strategy. So it has always been incredibly difficult to find money. And as Susan said, it is actually who you know at the time. It is the most stressful. Whatever. So that was one of the other things about UK Shared Prosperity Fund. This is what the programme's going to cost. These are our targets. These are our outcomes. You apply for it. You got it. You do it. And it removed that part about looking for match funding. So what you're actually looking for is not match funding. You're looking for more funding. And I think I would maybe possibly change that wording.
Edith, have you a different perspective on this?
Well, I suppose just what Lynn has actually said at the end, I know there is the issues with regards to match funding and things like that, but maybe is it more about looking to see what funding is there from our local departments and what's the funding from the UK shared, and pulling them together rather than saying you have to go looking. It's a better way of making sure that all the resources are used in the best way, I think, rather than saying that you have to go out and look for match fund. And then when you do apply, you're applying for 100% of funding. But it's maybe just that step beforehand is bringing the UK share, that quantum of money, the money that's available through our local departments, and bringing that together and seeing the best way to spend that money rather than our local departments going off and coming up with an idea separate from what the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is. So it's about bringing it together and using it better, way of reducing funding rather than splitting it across further departments. And and splitting the need as well and duplicating services and things that we know that has happened over the last period of time.
Thank you.
Norman, it's a brilliant question. And match funding, it's a double-edged sword. So we all know our funding was cut by nearly a third within the sector, within the youth sector, and we need more money to be able to provide the interventions and the support that the young people need. However, being held to account by two different sets of bosses, and if they're going to squash our enthusiasm and our passion and our ability to support young people and just create another layer of bureaucracy, it's not helpful. But like Lynn said, if it was more funding and there wasn't so many conditions with match funding, I'm sure we'd all welcome more funding.
I'm wondering, is there an element in some of your organisations, or correct me if I'm wrong, of you, before you're sort of guarding your pots of money and your sources of revenue, and then in some instances you had to join together in groups, as Norman was saying. Did any of you do that, and was it good or bad?
Yeah, I don't mind speaking. So we went from being a lead partner within ESF to being part of a consortium. So 7 leading youth work organisations realised we can't compete against each other if we want to survive. We need to form an alliance. We need to collaborate and recognise that the impact and value of youth worker in relation to employment for young people. So 7 organisations came together. Youth Action are the lead, and we're with Springboard, Bites, Northern Ireland Youth Forum, Start 360 and ourselves. And it's actually the value of the partnership working outweighs the challenges. And I don't know, is it because we're all singing from the same hymn sheet and we all have shared value base of working with the hardest to reach young people, but there's definitely been added value.
Yeah, we actually started with 5 organisations that had been working together as a consortium or a partnership under ESF, so it wasn't just quite so difficult for us to move forward into UK Shared Prosperity. But GEMS, in my own organisation, we actually had to roll up 2 projects which were very close to our hearts, our Minority Ethnic Employability Support Project and our Learning Language for Work project. And we also had a project called COMENT, which was collaborative mentoring for young people. So we were kind of a bit upset that we were going to have to actually lose those aspects. But I think what everybody has found within the UK Shared Prosperity funding that they're not mutually exclusive. I think that most of our organisations would find that we work with very high numbers of people who experience mental ill health, who do note that they have a disability, that are excluded maybe from structurally excluded as well too. So we didn't have that big sort of jump into the old saying of partnerships are based on mutual loathing in the pursuit of funding, which was something I heard a long time ago. We actually came in as sort of a tried and tested partnership, but again, trying to diversify and actually provide a project which fitted into that sort of box of economically inactive without trying to take away from the innovation and the approach that is always about helping a person to have an emotional lift before you can achieve a positional shift. And that's always been really close to what we've tried to do. So I think somebody said earlier on there about we don't need all these strategies. I think it may have been Celine. We've 2 years down the line in developing very innovative and cost-effective approaches to working with people who are economically inactive, which is a horrible word, so we need a new one for it. They do contribute economically, just maybe not in the same way as if you had a wage coming in every week. But I think that we need to take that learning and ensure whatever comes after is actually fit for purpose, and that we're not all exhausted at the end of trying to complete yet another funding application.
Thank you. Okay, from the panel, anybody? Oh, okay. Any more questions from the body of the hall? Yes, microphone over there.
Thanks, Gillian Lewis. I'm with the Northern Ireland Health Collective with CO3. I was just interested, most people have mentioned this morning that the eligibility criteria meant that there were certain groups that were left out. And I'm just interested if if the organisations did what third sector organisations do, which is just try and stretch their core provision to make sure that once someone comes to you, you don't want to say no, and then that puts pressure on your core services and how that's felt and was managed within the services. And if that wasn't the case, then is there a structure for those needs of those people who are now not being met, being advocate for somewhere else? And is there an avenue for that to happen?
Okay, does anybody want to take?
Yeah, my organisation did really struggle with the fact that there were many people who were not eligible within the UK Shared Prosperity Funding eligibility criteria. But I'm really pleased and indeed grateful to say that we did deliver a project led by Belfast City Council who listened to us and allowed us to actually expand our criteria to provide some of those employability supports, and very, very grateful for that. We also went out and got small pieces of money from a range of funders who enabled us to provide things like conversation cafes, like one-to-one support for asylum seekers, and also most recently through the Refugee Integration Fund, we were able to deliver mentoring support for refugees and asylum seekers, and we had some support from Invest NI and other key employers there. It irritates me at times that you have to almost try and twist yourself into a way in which to really encourage those that have hold the purses to actually see that if you can do this, you can improve the economic prosperity of Northern Ireland if you can do that, and that you can't just put people into silos, which is what we've all been trying to escape from for the last 30, 40 years. So yeah, we do find ways, but it is challenging.
Yeah, again, a great question. We struggled with it because we find it unjust. One of our core values is about equality, and to be able to say to somebody, no, you're not eligible for this pot of funding, even though the need is there, just seemed unfair. We do continue to work with the young people who aren't eligible, but through different pots of funding. Our data collection is mad because you have young people who are on Shared Prosperity Fund and you have other young people who aren't. But again, we would just always lobby and try and influence that the successor for this programme will have a wider eligibility criteria.
Okay.
So I think I mentioned at the beginning that it wasn't that difficult for us because very high numbers of women are actually economically inactive, which is when you see that there's 3% of the fund is aimed at women is quite a shocking statistic. But what it did mean was that, I mean, years and years ago when I started out working in unemployment and labour market, somebody told me, you know, like there's a spectrum. And at this side is good work, a good job, and then you've precarious work, and then you've unemployment, and the gig economy, and then you've got economic inactivity and the various gradations down to here. But you're working with people who need a lot of help and a lot of assistance. So with the ESF, I think it's easier to work with those who are closer to work. They need less investment. You meet your outcomes more quickly. But what it did mean for us is that you had to put more effort into this. And I think for all of us, that's the reality of it. And that then means more investment and more time is needed, as in duration on the programme, which probably didn't help. But we also had programmes then that allowed maybe unemployed women or women who were in different situations who they could access those. And that had happened because we'd had to diversify our projects 5 years ago.
Yeah, very similar situation, I suppose, from the disability sector as well. Although there's a high percentage of people with disabilities are economically inactive, but just as what Lynn says, there's such a vast range within that economic inactivity across their areas of disability as well. So those people who you'd want to support that needed longer time, needed wraparound support, needed more, you know, looking at social inclusion, which has been obviously left out of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. So that meant, you know, that organisations were still really wanting to work with them and did work with them or looked at other types of funding as well. So I think what we're all trying to say here is that that needs to be widened, that economic inactivity, the definition in relation to that, and it is needing more support as well to allow people that are the furthest removed to be able to access and to get into employment as well. There definitely has been that shift from ESF into the UK Shared Prosperity Fund of getting people into work, and that's what we want to do. But there's a process there, there's a journey there for lots of people, and it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, and it definitely doesn't happen for a lot of people within 6 months. Thank you.
But sure, the government's going to help us get people back into work and off benefits.
By cutting benefits will not get people back into work.
See, there'll be another question from the floor. No? Can I get a quick answer then, or well, not too quick, but reasonably brief answer to this one? So aside from a bigger pot of funds, what changes or improvements do you think should be made to the current model used for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund going forward? So just a few headlines. Susan, would you like to?
I think they need to look at the experience of the last 2 years and to look at where the actual gaps have been, and which we've talked about here. I think that they need to not reinvent the wheel, but need to actually build on the actual success of what we've done over the last 2 years.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Susan. It's not about reinventing the wheel. We have tried and tested ways of working here. We have had so many evaluations that demonstrate the impact that all our projects have had. So again, don't reinvent the wheel.
So the organisation of the fund, I mean, is there anything that you would change?
I had such a bad experience many years ago that this has been a positive one. I mean, I can't say it. It really has been a positive one. It's not a partnership. It's still a funding relationship. But I have found people in the department very easy to work with and respectful of our work and understanding that we're the experts in what we do. I mean, there's still audit. One of the things I really love, I have to say, I don't know if other people feel this, is that you're audited externally instead of that you've somebody in, you know, going through the pieces of paper, that the external assurance piece happens, and I just think that's a lot easier. I'm struck this morning by something Eve said, that I do think regionality has to be explored and addressed. You know, there's so many Belfast, including ourselves, like Belfast-based organisations, but 85% of Northern Ireland is rural. And, you know, so those gaps have to be addressed, and the equality areas and identities have to be looked at as well, which maybe if they were missing from the beginning.
Okay.
I will agree with all that's gone ahead, what people have said there as well. I think it has been, there's been pros and cons, I think, in relation to sort of the administration in relation to that, but it has worked out, I think, very much so, that it has definitely better than what ESF was in the bureaucracy. I think it is just about listening to the organisations and their expertise and taking that on board. You know, and we can help co-design. And I think it's about acknowledging as well, within one of the big changes with ESF to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, under ESF there was themes. You had a theme for young people, you had a theme for disability, and you had a theme for long-term unemployed. And within those themes, they recognised that in certain groupings that there was needing additional support, longer time, and additional funding. And now we have a flat rate, you know, in relation to that, and that makes it difficult. So I think maybe to look at that area as well is important to do.
And what would you say to the people in government in Westminster or in Stormont to say, what should their main battle cry be?
We need clarity, continuity and flexibility to respond to those local needs, plus ring-fenced funding for social inclusion and equality-based work.
Appropriate administration, so not too much bureaucracy, so that most of the funding can go directly to service delivery.
Agree with all of those. I think we need decisions more quickly. I don't, and I mean, I'm saying this is probably off the thing, but I'm not interested in co-design at this stage. We've been there, we've done it. People know what they're doing, but we need decisions quickly. It's a very difficult labour market out there, and it's very difficult to retain our staff who have expertise.
Okay. Thank you very much. And
I was just going to agree with everyone that's gone ahead as well. And I think one of the things but they need to do it now. We cannot wait. We cannot, you know, I don't know how much we can stress this time and time again. It is about the time. we cannot be like what we did the last time. It, you know, it really nearly destroyed us. And I mean that from a personal perspective, to organisations, to the individuals. It really did. It was such a dramatic time that we can't go back to that again. And one of the other things I think people have to remember too within all of this is that, you know, it's about economics as well, because we have in Northern Ireland the lowest rate of unemployment at the moment. So I know our businesses are looking to get more people into employment, and we need to provide the support to help them to get more people into employment. So there's a total economic argument of investing more in these programmes to help more people who are the furthest removed from the labour market, who are that untapped labour force that our businesses are needing here. So if we want to, as an organisation or as Northern Ireland, we need more people, but we need the right support. And a lot of the projects that are working within this are working with employers as well, and they're working with helping the employers to see that they maybe need to look at their practices differently as well. So that's just another final call.
Thank you very much indeed. So I think with that, we can end this panel discussion. So thanks to Edith, Claire, Susan and Lynn. And before you can take your time getting down, because at the moment we're going to play. While you're making your way there, we're going to play a wonderful video, and that is of Conor Ginnity.
The journey of accessing to Primark was a very enjoyable experience. It has helped me in more ways than one. Apart from the financial independence, the social independence, it has allowed me to show future employers what, instead of what they think we can add, what we actually can bring to their organisation, and allow future employers to, and those with learning disabilities, to shine and to let everybody know not who we are, but what we can be and what we can bring to the organisation.
Fantastic. And finally, I'm going to call on Neil Anderson again to come and say a final few words.
I promise I'll be brief. Just a few words of thanks. First of all, Maggie, again, thank you to you. Chairing and managing an event like this, it is a skill, and not everybody has it, and you've kept us perfectly to time, so thank you. Can I thank everybody at the Women's Centre, all of the staff here, for hosting us so well and providing such a fabulous venue. And also to the people in the room who've supported the event today on the technical side and with the signing, thank you. Of course, thanks again to all of our participants for the fantastic insights you've shared with us today, and thank you for supporting us with the event, and Eve and Horizons Research for the work that you've done. And finally, can I thank the Equality Commission staff. When I got here today, Claire Meban asked me the completely natural question if I'd been busy in the run-up to this. And it made me pause and think, well, actually, for me personally, not terribly to do with this event, and that's because of the fantastic work that everybody from the Equality Commission has done on my behalf, so thank you. At a similar event to this many years ago, where a research report was being launched, I learned an important lesson about brevity at the end. I'd come to the platform with several pages of speaking notes because I naively thought that at the end of a fantastic event like this, I could add immense, insight and so on, with my comments and analysis at that stage. Fortunately, I just read the room when I got up. We didn't have a Maggie, so it had overshot considerably. The room was stiflingly hot, and to make it worse, in the adjacent room, you could hear the sound of plates and cups and knives and forks and so on being set out, and the smell of food was beginning to waft into the room. So I just explained I was setting the notes aside and why I was setting the notes aside, and I simply said, thank you all for coming. This is our research report. Please help us to share it widely, and enjoy your lunch. And as soon as I got down off the stage, one of the delegates approached me and they said, Neil, I am really sorry you didn't get to make all of your comments, but good call. So thank you all for coming. This is our research report. Please help us to share it widely and enjoy your lunch.